Hello and welcome to another episode of Adulting with Hannah. I'm Hannah, here today to talk about some more serial killers. If you're new to the series, I've been doing videos about serial killers based on their zodiac sign in order to, at the end, kind of assess the differences between serial killers and if there's any differences amongst the zodiac signs for people who kill. In this episode, we're going to be talking about all the serial killers who are Geminis. And this one hopefully won't be as long as some of the others, but some of them get pretty long, especially my most recent one, Capricorn. But that is really just because I'm going through every single serial killer who is a Capricorn. So if you haven't seen any of my other videos, I think I've done 6 or 7 of the zodiac sign, and we're getting really close to the end. So let's do Gemini next. This first one is somebody that I had never heard of, but he's a pretty prolific serial killer, and I'm just surprised nobody's made a movie about his life because this one's really interesting. So this is the story of Pedro Rodriguez Filho. He was born July 17th, 1954 in Brazil. He started out the world in a kind of rough way. He had a really bad bruise on his brain because his dad kicked his mother while she was pregnant with him. When he got older, he started seeking out other criminals. Him and his friends would go and kill criminals in the area they lived in Brazil. He was convicted of 71 murders, but claimed to have killed 100 people or more. And when he was 13, that was when he first expressed his desire to kill people. When he was 14, he committed his first murder and he shot the mayor of the town he was in. He says that he decided to kill the mayor because the mayor had fired his dad, who was a security guard there at the time. So then he moved to Sao Paulo and began robbing people and doing drugs. He met a woman, they started living together, and she got pregnant. A rival gang executed his pregnant girlfriend before she was able to have the baby, and so he went on a killing spree trying to kill everybody he thought was responsible for murdering his girlfriend. Eventually he would find out who was responsible for the attack and would crash a wedding, killing 7 people and wounding 16. By this point, he wasn't even 18 years old yet. He then murdered his own father. He hit him 21 times with a machete. It turns out Pedro's father had killed his mother, so that's why he decided to murder him. He also ripped out his father's heart, chewed it up, and spat it out. He was arrested for the first time in 1973 when he was 19, and he had already killed many people. He was originally sentenced to 126 years in prison, but was released in 2003 because Brazil has a law where you can't spend more than 30 years in prison, apparently. Of the 71 people he was formally convicted of, 42 of them were murdered while he was in prison. So he was eventually sentenced to 400 years in prison and then released again in 2007. He moved to a rural town, was arrested again in 2011, and he was released again in 2018. So at this point, he's spent a total of 42 years in prison. So he is currently free and living in Brazil. He was actually on a podcast called the Cortez Podcast in May of 2021. He talks about his crimes and everything on there, but it's all in Portuguese. So if you speak Portuguese, you can go watch it. Next up, we have the most prolific American serial killer, but a lot of people have never even heard of him. His name is Samuel Little. He was born June 7th, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia. He claims that his mother was a prostitute, so that he was mostly raised by his grandmother, and they moved to Ohio shortly after he was born. He had issues at school with discipline, and he admitted to having sexual fantasies about strangling women from a very young age. As a teenager, he would collect magazines about true crime, and they would show images of women being choked, and he found that arousing. His crime started in 1956 when he was only 16. He was charged for breaking and entering and was sent to juvie. In his late 20s, he moved to Florida, and that's when he began traveling around and getting in trouble with the law. He was arrested in 8 different states for crimes like DUIs, fraud, shoplifting, solicitation, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and rape. In 1975, when he was 35, he'd been arrested 26 times in 11 states. His first murder charge happened in 1982 when he was 42 for the murder of a 22-year-old woman. Melinda Lepre had gone missing in Mississippi earlier that year. The jury, for whatever reason, wouldn't indict him for the murder, so then he was charged for another woman's murder, 26-year-old Patricia, and her body was also found in Florida in 1982. But he was acquitted in 1984 due to mistrust of witness testimony. After this, he moved to San Diego and was arrested for kidnapping, beating, and strangling a 22-year-old woman, but she survived. A month later, he was found with an unconscious woman in the backseat of his car. She had been beaten and strangled in the same location as the previous attempted murder. He was only sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for both crimes and was released in 1987. He moved to LA and then committed 10 murders there. And in 2012, he was finally arrested at a homeless shelter in Kentucky. He was extradited to California for a narcotics charge, but DNA revealed that he was linked to 3 of those murders in LA. He was tried for the murder of 3 women in 2014, was found guilty and sentenced to 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole. After he was arrested, he started confessing to previous crimes. So after all of those confessions were confirmed, it was determined that he is the most prolific serial killer in American history. He is confirmed to have killed 60 women and confessed to 93. He died in prison in December of 2020 when he was 80 years old. So comment down below if you had ever heard of him. A lot of people, when I ask who is the most prolific serial killer in the United States, they always say something like Ted Bundy. Not Ted Bundy, it was Samuel Little. Robert Lee Yates, he was born May 27th, 1952 in Washington. So it turns out in 1945, his own grandmother murdered his own grandfather with an axe. So just a lot of fun in that family. He was hired by the Washington State Penitentiary to be a corrections officer in 1975, joined the Army 2 years later, and served 21.5 years in the military. He was arrested in 2000 for murdering 11 women in the Washington area from 1975 to 1988. He typically targeted sex workers in the Spokane area. He would solicit them for drugs or sex and then shoot them in the head, disposing of their bodies in rural areas. He actually buried one of his victims right outside his wife's bedroom window, which is very reminiscent of Ed Kemper, if anybody has heard of him. But then he was arrested in the year 2000 for the murder of a woman named Jennifer Joseph. When they searched his car, they found her blood and his DNA, and they were able to connect that DNA with 12 other victims. So he was charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder in the year 2000. He was sentenced to death in 2002, which was commuted to a life sentence of 408 years in 2018. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer's a Gemini. Lots of talk in the media about Jeffrey Dahmer right now. There's a show. I haven't watched it, but I've heard it's really good. He was born May 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys from 1978 to 1991. Many of his later victims included preservation of body parts, necrophilia, cannibalism. Things escalated quickly. His victims all ranged in age from 14 to 32. He was eventually diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and a psychotic disorder. But at his trial, he was found to be legally sane somehow. He was sentenced to 15 different life sentences back to back in February of 1992. He died at age 34. He was beaten to death by a fellow inmate in 1994 at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. So yeah, there's a lot more to this story. I briefly touched on it. There's literally 100 documentaries out there about Jeffrey Dahmer, including the new dramatized show with Evan Peters. So if you're interested in Jeffrey Dahmer, there's all that out there. Arthur Shawcross, he was born June 6, 1945 in Maine. So his first murders happened when he was only 27. He murdered a young boy and a girl in 1972 in New York. The little girl was named Karen and she was only 8. The boy was named Jack and he was 10. Both were sexually assaulted before their murder and they only happened a couple months apart. He pled guilty to one of them and manslaughter for the other and served 14 years of a 25-year sentence. So he was released from prison after murdering 2 children for some freaking reason. And then he murdered 12 more people after that. At that point, he was targeting sex workers in Rochester. His MO wasn't super consistent, so it made hard for investigators to track him down. He typically targeted sex workers in the Rochester area, and his MO wasn't very consistent, so it was hard for investigators to keep track of him. But he did admit to eating parts of the genitals of some of his victims. I don't have his sentence written down, so I apologize, but he died at age 63 in 2008. Lorenzo Gilliard, he was born May 24th, 1950 in Kansas City, Missouri. He was charged with 6 counts of murder in 2007, but it's believed that he raped and murdered at least 13 women from 1977 to 1993, so a very long time period. He had had aggressive behavior from a young age and had a reputation as a bully. He dropped out of school and married a woman after he found out she was pregnant at 18. He was arrested in 1973 for assaulting his wife, and she told police that he was abusing her for the entirety of their marriage. But he was only forced to pay a fine. Because, you know, money is more important than justice, I guess. So he was arrested shortly after for raping a 25-year-old woman, but the charges were dropped. It turns out he was able to reach an agreement with the victim, but then 5 months later he raped a 13-year-old girl. But he only went to jail for 9 months for that. After his release, he married another woman who he abused as well, and then he married a third wife in the late 70s. In 1979, he was arrested for raping another girl and threatened to kill her fiancé. Both victims were able to identify him as their attacker, but got acquitted by a jury due to lack of evidence. He was arrested for assaulting his third wife, because he has an MO, clearly, people, hello. He got away with it with another fine and mandatory divorce. In 1981, he attacked his ex-wife. On 2 separate occasions, he knocked out her front teeth and stabbed her hand with an ice pick. So he was charged with assault, but was released on probation. Are we not keeping track of this rap sheet? Is this rap sheet on separate sticky notes on different people's desks? Because, excuse me? In 1981, he was finally sent to prison for 4 years because he violated parole. His longest prison sentence was for violating parole. And he's assaulted, raped, attacked many women at this point. He got a 4 times longer prison sentence for violating parole for theft than he did for raping a 13-year-old. America. I can't. He was released on parole in 1983, but started making bomb threats, so he went back to prison in 1985. 1987, he was arrested in the connections of a murder, so we're finally getting arrested for murder. He married his 4th wife in 1991. How is this man still marrying people? That's what I want to know. How is that happening? So things kind of go cold after 1993. Lots of stuff happened. Things go cold in 1993. 2001 rolls around. KCPD gets a grant to do some investigation using DNA technology, because that's like the big thing now. So he had given a blood sample after the sexual harassment charge in 1996, and then was connected to 6 murders in the Kansas City area with DNA evidence. He was also linked to 6 more murders with circumstantial evidence. So all of his victims turned out to be between the ages of 15 and 36. They were all strangled with things like nylon stockings or shoelaces, and they were dumped in areas around Kansas City like landfills, snowdrifts, abandoned buildings, and fields. All but one of his victims were sex workers. 9 of them were found partially naked and 11 of them were sexually abused. In 2007, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He's currently serving his sentence in Missouri, and he's 71. Peter Sutcliffe, he was born June 2nd, 1946 in England. He's better known as the Yorkshire Ripper. There's a lot of rippers in this one, which is not cool. I don't know why I'm smiling. Not cool. If you have to do some nasty shit to be called the Ripper. Just saying. He was found guilty of murdering 13 women and trying to murder 7 more from 1975 to 1980. He left school at 18, had menial jobs, was fired in 1976 for theft. This is sounding like a Criminal Minds profile. So he developed an obsession on voyeurism, and he liked to spy on sex. So he started murdering women and girls in residential areas, but then started preying on sex workers because it was just easier, I guess. They were more vulnerable. So the manhunt to find him was one of the most extensive and expensive manhunts in British history. West Yorkshire police were criticized for taking so long to catch him, even though he was interviewed 9 times during his 5-year killing spree. So he's associated with 13 murders and 10 attacks in the area. In 1981, police finally caught him in the act with a 24-year-old prostitute, but he was arrested because the car he was driving had a fake license plate. So he matched the physical description of the Yorkshire Ripper and was questioned in relation to the murders. So police went back to where he was arrested and found a knife, hammer, and rope that he had managed to stash nearby before he was taken away. 2 days later, he confessed that he was the Yorkshire Ripper, calmly described the attacks to investigators, and claimed that God was telling him to murder these women because they were filth. He was charged in 1981 for 13 murders. He claimed he was guilty only to 1 count of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility because he claimed he was hearing the voice of God. He was found guilty of murder on all counts and was sentenced to 20 life sentences to be served concurrently, which was commuted to a whole life order. He died in November of 2020 at age 74 of COVID-19. Kenneth Bianchi, this is a really in-depth case that, well, a lot of these are, but this is one that I'm not going to go into, but that I recommend you reading about if you're interested in a true crime, which hopefully you are if you're watching this video. This is Kenneth Bianchi. He was part of the Hillside Strangler murders that took place 1977 to 1979. There are some excellent episodes of Morbid on this, the only podcast that I recommend most of the time. So he was born May 22nd in Rochester, New York. He's convicted of 12 murders in a 2-year period, which, like I said, are referred to as the Hillside Strangler murders. He committed these murders with his cousin Angelo Bruno. After they were arrested after a whole long ordeal, which I'm not going to get into, Bianchi agreed to testify testify against Bruno in order to receive a lesser sentence, but he eventually just kind of gave cops the runaround and was very inconsistent with his testimony. He's currently serving his life sentence at Washington State Penitentiary. He was denied parole in 2010, but is eligible again in 2025, but he is currently 70 years old. Peter Curtin, he was born May 26, 1883 in Germany, and he is known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, and that is not a fun nickname. So he was convicted of 9 murders in a 9-month period. So 1 murder a month, which seems like a lot to me, but what do I know? This all took place in 1929. So he's called the Vampire of Dusseldorf, obviously because he wanted to drink the blood of his victims, or attempted to. Also, his victims were found in pretty shocking conditions after their murders. He was sentenced to death in 1931 and was beheaded when he was 48. Elizabeth Wettlaufer. She was born June 10th, 1967 in Canada. She was hired at Crescent Care, I don't know how to say it, Crescent Care in 2007, which is a long-term senior care home in Canada. She actually struggled with substance abuse during her time at Crescent Care, mostly with alcoholism. She would show up to work drunk. She would often be found in the basement passed out during her night shift, and she was suspended 4 times for medication-related errors, meaning she was giving people the wrong medication. She was finally fired for this in 2014, and it turns out that while working there, she was actually intentionally dosing some of her patients with insulin as well. The assault began mid to late 2007, shortly after she was hired. She had 6 victims who were all aged 79 to 96. And they all died of an insulin overdose. She had attempted to murder 6 other victims, but at this point she's just been fired for that medication incident. But in 2016, she enters a drug rehab in Toronto, and to the rehab staff, she actually made her confession about the murders that took place at Crescent. They notified police. She faxed over a 4-page handwritten confession to the College of Nurses in Ontario. But it turns out she had actually confessed to the murders before, but her lawyer was like, don't tell anybody that. And she was like, okay. So she was formally charged with the murders in October of 2016. She was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms with the possibility of parole after 25 years, and she is currently 54. So she'll be eligible for parole in like 2042-ish, depending on when the sentencing happened. Andris Pandy, he was born June 1st, 1927 in Czechoslovakia. He would eventually go on to live in Belgium, so most of this took place in Belgium. He would marry 2 different women and would often engage in incestuous relationships with either his kids or his second wife's kids from a previous marriage, so his stepkids, and he would impregnate them. But at the same time, he was also meeting women through newspaper ads, and these women would all typically kind of mysteriously go missing. So eventually people started talking about the incest, and his victims started coming forward. So he eventually took care of that situation by murdering most of his family. He murdered his current wife and then his ex-wife, 2 of his biological children, and 2 of his stepchildren. And then after all this happened, they found the remains of 7 other women in his home that he presumably met through this newspaper scheme that he was doing. So he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died in 2013 when he was 86. David Berkowitz is another big namer that a lot of people have probably heard of. He is also known as the Son of Sam. He was born June 1st, 1953 in New York. Like I said, he was known as the Son of Sam, but he was also known as the .44 caliber killer. And he pled guilty to 8 shootings in New York City that began in July of 1976. His big thing was writing letters to the police. His letters were often like really rambling and nonsensical, very demanding, bizarre. There's one of his letters known as the Son of Sam letter, in which he identified his moniker. It was left near 2 of his victims' bodies, and that was when he was like, hey, call me the Son of Sam killer, not the .44 caliber killer. And the police were like, yeah, okay, sure. The Son of Sam moniker actually isn't his dad. Like, his dad isn't Sam. His neighbor is Sam. It's just weird. But he believed that his neighbor Sam's dog, who was a black lab, was possessed by an ancient demon and was commanding Berkowitz to kill people. He was determined competent to stand trial despite this obvious mental issue. He was sentenced to 25 years to life for each murder to be served consecutively. He pleaded guilty, so he would be eligible. He was eligible for parole in 2003, but he usually skips the hearings altogether, and he doesn't ever ask to be released. He said, in all honesty, I believe that I deserve to be in prison for the rest of my life. I have, with God's help, long ago come to terms with my situation and have accepted my punishment. He was supposed to have another hearing in May of 2020, but it was delayed due to COVID. I wrote this a while ago, so I don't know if that's been updated, sorry. But he's currently serving his sentence in New York, and he is 68. Richard Trenton Chase was born May 23rd, 1950 in California. He's known as the Vampire of Sacramento. We have a lot of rippers and a lot of vampires here in the Gemini zodiac. He is a serial killer, rapist, and cannibal, and necrophile. That's quite a list. So he killed 6 people in a 1-month period in Sacramento. He went on trial for 6 murders in 1979 and was trying to avoid the death sentence by being found guilty of second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder, but he was sentenced to death anyway. He was scheduled to die in a gas chamber in 1980, but he was found dead in his cell before that was taking place at age 30. It turns out that he unalived himself using antidepressants that he had saved over the course of several weeks. Thomas Neil Cream, he was born May 27th, 1850 in Scotland. When he was 4, his family actually moved to Canada, so that's where a lot of this takes place. So he actually went on to get his medical license in 1878 and would go on to marry a woman named Flora. I mentioned that just because I really like her name. So he is convicted of poisoning 5 people, including his wife, and is suspected to have killed 4 other women while performing illegal abortions at the time. He was sentenced to death in 1892 at age 42. There's this rumor that he confessed to being Jack the Ripper at his hanging, but it turns out that he was in prison in Illinois during the Ripper murders, so he's not Jack the Ripper. Edward Edwards. This is an interesting one for lots of reasons. First of all, his name is Edward Edwards, which is like, why would you do that? Second of all, he was born June 14th, 1933 in Ohio, but that's not the interesting thing. We'll get to the interesting thing. He said that he grew up in an orphanage and was abused by the nuns. He would rob gas stations and didn't disguise himself because he wanted to be famous. So he was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list by 1961. He was arrested in 1962, paroled in 1967. And then in 2009, he was arrested for 4 murders. He confessed to a 5th murder and was given a death sentence for that in 2010. So Rolling Stone wrote an article where they interviewed John Cameron, who is a retired cold case detective. And John Cameron thinks that Edward Edwards is the most prolific serial killer of all time. He also thinks that Edwards is responsible for some really high profile cases like JonBenet Ramsey, the little girl that was found dead in her home around Christmas in 1996. Lacey Peterson, who was a pregnant teacher, murdered in 2002. Scott Peterson was the one that was charged for 2 counts of murders for Lacey and their son Connor. Teresa Halbach, who is the one that Stephen Avery was arrested for murdering in Making a Murderer. Cameron believes that Edwards did that as well. Adam Walsh, who was murdered in 1981, and his dad, John Walsh, went on to host America's Most Wanted. Jimmy Hoffa, he believes that Edwards killed Jimmy Hoffa, who went missing in 1975, and that was like a whole mafia conspiracy thing. Steve Branch, Michael Moore, Christopher Byers. Cameron believes that Edwards was responsible for the West Memphis 3 killings in 1993 somehow. And then he also believes Edwards is responsible for the killing of Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia, who was found in 1947, cut in half in a yard in LA. Cameron also believes that Edwards is the Zodiac killer from the late 60s and also responsible for the Atlanta child murders, where 30 children were murdered in Atlanta from 1979 to 1981. So that sounds very exciting, but it's obviously kind of a stretch. Basically, Cameron is attributing Edward Edwards to pretty much every high-profile murder case in the last 50 years. So it's a little much. He's been labeled as a crackpot and a conspiracy theorist, unfortunately, for his ramblings, which are kind of unsubstantiated. However, another detective does believe more conservatively that Edwards can be attributed to maybe 15 more murders than what he was originally charged with. However, Edwards died of natural causes in 2011, which was just 4 months before his scheduled lethal injection when he was 77. That one's crazy, mostly just because of all the conspiracies. And it's, the weird thing is this is like somebody that most people have never heard of. Danny Rolling, he was born May 26th, 1954 in Louisiana. His dad was a cop and was very abusive to the entire family. As a teen and a young adult, he was arrested many times for robbery and peeping. So he would go on to murder 5 students in Florida over the course of 4 days in 1990. He also confessed to a triple homicide that happened back in his home state of Louisiana. He also attempted to murder his own father and committed several sexual assaults as well. He was sentenced to death and executed in 2006 when he was 52. Dale Cregan, he was born June 6, 1983 in England. He is convicted of murdering 2 female police officers in Manchester in 2012. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2013 after committing 2 other murders in a gang-related event. He's currently in prison and he is 39. Frank Gust was born May 24th, 1969 in Germany. He's called the Ryan Rue Ripper. So we have another Ripper. And his crimes were all kind of similar to Jack the Ripper. So that's how he earned that name. He's a sexual sadist who was convicted of killing 4 women and engaged in necrophilia with their bodies from 1994 to 1998. In 1999, he told his mom that he had killed people. She told her friend, and then he was arrested because obviously her friend was like, what? So he was sentenced to life in prison and is currently 53. David Meyerhofer, he was born June 8th, 1949 in Montana. He confessed to 4 murders from 1967 to 1974. 3 of them were children. He unalived himself shortly after his confession at age 25, so he never actually went to trial. However, the interesting thing about him is that he is the first serial killer who was ever investigated by the FBI using their new method of psychologically profiling criminals. Kathleen Folbig was born June 14th, 1967 in Australia. She is convicted of murdering her 3 infant children aged 8 months, 10 months, and 19 months. And then she was also convicted of manslaughter of a 4th child who was only 19 days old. The crimes all took place from 1989 to 1999. Eventually, her husband found out that she was responsible for the death of his children when he found her personal diary that confessed to the crimes, and obviously he took that to the police. She was sentenced to 40 years and will be eligible for parole in 2028. She maintains her innocence and claims that her children died of natural causes, and she's currently 55. D'Angelo Martin, he was born May 30th, 1985 in Michigan. He murdered 45 women. 45? That can't be right. 4 women. It was a typo. These were in order from like most victims to least, so like we would not be at 45 right now. Okay, he murdered 4 women and sexually assaulted 2 others in Detroit in a 5-month period from 2018 to 2019. This case is actually current and ongoing. His sentencing is set to take place in October of 2022. So he would typically target prostitutes. He pled guilty to the rapes and murders in September of 2022, so just this month. He's currently 37 and was sentenced to 45 to 70 years in prison. He was able to avoid a life sentence due to a plea deal, but his sentencing, like I said, will take place in just a couple weeks. Today is October 1st, so I think his sentencing is set to take place in a couple weeks from today, but I don't know when this video is gonna go up, so it might already happen. I don't know. Duke Pearson was born May 21st, 1933, somewhere in the United States. He is actually a former detective sergeant of the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. He's connected to the deaths of 3 women, including his wife, who died in the summer of 1967. He was actually never arrested and died in 2019 before he could ever be investigated. Silvo Plut was born May 29th, 1968 in Slovenia. He killed his first victim in 1990 and was paroled in 2003. He killed another woman in 2004 in Serbia, but was able to escape to Slovenia and killed a 3rd woman and attempted to kill her husband. So after all this, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison in 2006, but unalived himself a year later at age 38. Trevor Hardy was born June 11th, 1945 in England. He murdered 3 teenage girls in Manchester in a 2-year period. He would go on to brag about his second victim to his younger brother. So he was arrested and then released due to an alibi that was made up by his girlfriend. There was also teeth marks on one of his victim's body, and while he was in jail, he was able to file down his teeth with a emery board in order to make it so they didn't match the bite marks. He would go on to kill another victim 6 months later, and then was arrested again and found guilty for murder in 1977, where he was sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 2012 at age 67. Anthony Hardy, not related to the previous guy, born May 31st, 1951 in England. He is known as the Camden Ripper. We have another Ripper, because he would dismember some of his victims after killing them. He was sentenced to life in prison for 3 murders, but police believe he is responsible for 5 more. He died in prison in 2020 at age 69. Daisy DeMelker, she was born June 1st, 1986 in South Africa. She poisoned 2 of her husband and her only son for insurance money. She was only convicted of the murder of her son and was executed in 1932 at age 46. Miroslav Stelik, he was born June 14th, 1956 in the Czech Republic. He raped 14 women in an 11-month period in 1983 and killed 2 of them. By age 18, he had spent 9 years in prison for rape. He was released in 1982 and ordered to take sexological treatment, which I don't know what that involves. So he committed his first murder while still in treatment and then committed his second one less than 13 hours after he was released from treatment. So whatever that treatment was, doesn't really work. So he was sentenced to death in 1986 when he was only 30. Jose Luis Calva. He was born June 20th, 1969 in Mexico. He was charged with murdering 2 people and cannibalizing their bodies, but he is suspected to have killed 8 total. Police discovered his proclivities when they went to his house to arrest him in 2007 to question him about the disappearance of his girlfriend. But at that point, he was found eating a dish of human meat. They found more evidence of cannibalism in his apartment, and he unalived himself a couple months later at age 38 before he went to trial. Wayne Williams was born May 27th, 1958 in Georgia. He's convicted of murdering 2 men in Atlanta in 1981, but he is believed to have been responsible for at least 24 of the 30 murders that took place in Atlanta from 1979 to 1981. I mentioned them earlier. They are known as the Atlanta child murders. He was sentenced to life in prison and is currently 64. He was actually portrayed in season 2 of Mindhunter for the Atlanta child murders, but he has never officially been tried for them. Bobby Jack Fowler, he was born June 12, 1939 in Texas. He was formally charged with only 1 murder, but is suspected to have killed up to 20 people. He traveled around the United States as a construction worker, and he's a person of interest in 16 murder cases just in the Pacific Northwest. He died in prison at age 66 after being arrested in 1995 for kidnapping and sexually assaulting a pregnant woman. The pregnant woman was found trying to escape through a hotel window and fell out of the window with like ropes tied to her feet, but she was able to survive. He died in prison in 2006 when he was 66. John Norman Collins was born June 17th, 1947 in Canada. He was the perpetrator of the Michigan murders, which were a highly publicized series of killings of young women from 1967 to 1969. The victims were all aged 13 to 21. They were abducted, raped, and beaten, and he would usually murder them by strangling or stabbing them. Collins was staying at his uncle's home, who was actually a police sergeant. The family was on vacation and Collins was staying at their house while they were gone. When the family returned, the police sergeant's wife, so Collins' aunt, discovered incriminating evidence in their home that pointed to Collins being responsible for murder. He was already a suspect at the time, and they kind of confirmed it with blood evidence in the home. He was arrested and convicted of 1 murder, but is actually suspected of 7 more. He's currently in prison in Michigan, and he's 75. Those are all of the known serial killers who are Geminis. A lot of really fascinating ones that not a lot of people have heard about. We had a couple high profiles in this one as well. So please let me know if there were any of these you were shocked to hear about. Every time I do this research, I'm always like, how have I never heard of this one? This one's crazy. Also leave a comment below if there's which zodiac you think I should do next. Currently thinking about doing Scorpio because we're entering Scorpio season. So if you think that's a good idea, let me know. Otherwise, I've got these ones left to do. I'm not sure which ones I've done so far. I can't remember. But anyways, I really appreciate you watching this video and watching till the end. These videos take a lot of time and research, so it means a lot to me. But if you could give it a thumbs up, that would help a lot. And I hope you subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in my next video. He was arrested. He was arrested.